That necklace will never touch your neck, Sarah. It's been in our family for 4 generations, and it's meant for someone who actually belongs here. Barbara's voice carried across the private dining room at Romano's like a declaration of war, sharp enough to cut through the anniversary celebration and silence the entire table. My husband Mark's family had gathered to celebrate his grandparents' 60th wedding anniversary, but somehow the evening had become another opportunity for my mother-in-law to remind everyone exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. I'm Sarah, 32 years old, an elementary school teacher who fell in love with Mark 3 years ago and foolishly believed that love would be enough to earn acceptance into a family where bloodlines matter more than character. Sometimes the cruelest weapons are truths that haven't been fully revealed yet. The sapphire and diamond necklace sat in its velvet box at the center of our table, catching the restaurant's soft lighting like captured starlight. It was stunning. An intricate Victorian piece with 3 tiers of sapphires surrounded by diamonds, the kind of jewelry that belongs in museums or fairy tales. "Barbara, please," Mark's grandmother Rose said gently, her frail hands reaching toward the necklace box. "This is supposed to be a celebration." "It is a celebration, Grandma Rose," Barbara replied, her smile as sharp as her voice. "We're celebrating family, real family, the people who understand what it means to carry on traditions." Public humiliation feels different when it's wrapped in concern for family values. Around the table, Mark's relatives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. His sister Jessica studied her wine glass like it contained the secrets of the universe. His cousin David found his phone suddenly fascinating. Uncle Robert cleared his throat and made small talk about the weather. Nobody was going to defend me. Again. "The necklace has always been passed down to the eldest son's wife," Barbara continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when explaining obvious facts to particularly slow children. "Someone who appreciates its history, who understands what it represents." She looked directly at me when she said it, making sure everyone understood that I was neither of those things. When people show you who they are through consistent cruelty, believing them saves everyone time. Of course, when Mark finds someone suitable, the necklace will have a proper home. Someone who can wear it to the right events, who knows how to represent the family name appropriately. The words hit exactly as intended. After 3 years of marriage to her son, I was still someone temporary, someone unsuitable, someone who apparently couldn't be trusted with the family jewelry because I lacked whatever mysterious qualities made a person worthy of belonging. Mark reached for my hand under the table, squeezing gently, but he didn't say anything. He never said anything when his mother delivered these carefully crafted insults disguised as family discussions. "Mother, Sarah is family," he said quietly, the kind of weak protest that somehow made the silence afterward feel even louder. "Of course she is, dear." Barbara's smile could have powered the entire restaurant. "I'm simply explaining the tradition. The necklace requires a certain level of understanding about its significance." Being dismissed as temporary after 3 years of marriage feels like being erased in slow motion. I sat there listening to my mother-in-law explain why I wasn't worthy of wearing a piece of jewelry that had supposedly been in their family since the 1880s, and something inside me shifted. Not anger, though that was certainly present. Something cooler, more patient. Clarity. "The necklace is beautiful," I said quietly, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "It must mean a great deal to the family." Barbara's eyes narrowed slightly as if she'd been expecting an argument and was disappointed to be denied the satisfaction of a public confrontation. "Yes. Well, some things are more precious than others. Some things require the right appreciation." Sometimes the most dangerous response is simply agreeing while knowing information other people don't have. "I completely understand," I replied, reaching into my purse for the small leather folder I'd brought specifically for this moment. Family heirlooms should definitely be treated with proper respect and understanding. The table went quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Barbara's confident smile flickered slightly, like a candle in a draft. "What's that?" Jessica asked, nodding toward the folder in my hands. "Just some paperwork I thought might be relevant to tonight's conversation," I said, setting the folder on the table beside the necklace box. Family history can be so interesting when you really start researching it. Truth shared at the wrong moment becomes a weapon. Truth shared at the right moment becomes justice. Barbara's face had lost some of its color. "I'm sure whatever genealogy research you've been doing is lovely, dear, but the necklace's provenance is well documented." "Oh, I'm sure it is," I agreed. Though sometimes documentation reveals unexpected details about ownership and inheritance. The restaurant continued its elegant dance around us, servers delivering courses to other tables, couples sharing quiet conversations, families celebrating milestones. But at our table, something had shifted in the air like the moment before a storm breaks. Rose leaned forward with sudden interest. "Sarah, dear, what kind of paperwork did you bring?" So why did Barbara's sudden nervousness feel like the moment I finally understood that some battles require patience rather than passion? Growing up in a family of teachers gives you certain skills that transfer surprisingly well to navigating hostile family dynamics. My parents taught me to document behavior patterns, to research thoroughly before making accusations, and to understand that the most effective responses often come from knowledge rather than emotion. When you're used to managing difficult personalities in classrooms, family manipulation starts looking like behavior that needs correction rather than acceptance. I've been teaching third grade at Maple Elementary for 8 years, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that bullies rely on audiences and silence to maintain their power. They perform cruelty for attention, expecting either retaliation that makes them look reasonable or submission that confirms their dominance. Barbara had been performing her particular brand of sophisticated cruelty for 3 years, always in front of family members, always wrapped in concern for traditions or family values that somehow never seemed to apply when she wanted something. The difference between 8-year-old bullies and 60-year-old bullies is mainly that the older ones have better vocabulary. Mark and I met at his cousin's wedding, where I was +1 for my college roommate, and he was escaping from what he described as family politics. We spent the entire reception talking about books and travel, laughing at shared jokes, discovering we both preferred small gatherings to large parties. He was different then. More confident, more willing to express opinions that didn't match whatever his mother might approve of. I fell in love with his kindness, his quiet intelligence, his way of making even grocery shopping feel like an adventure. People don't naturally become conflict avoidant. They learn it from families where keeping peace requires sacrificing authenticity. The changes started gradually after we got engaged. Suggestions about wedding venues that would be more appropriate. Conversations about career paths that would complement the family's standing. Questions about my background that felt less like curiosity and more like inventory assessments. Barbara never said anything directly critical during those early months. Instead, she offered helpful observations about family expectations, gentle guidance about social protocols, concerned suggestions about how I might fit in better with their circle. When someone consistently treats you like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be welcomed, the message becomes clear regardless of politeness. The first real confrontation happened at Christmas dinner during our engagement year. I'd brought homemade gifts, hand-knitted scarves for the women, homemade preserves for the men. Things I'd spent weeks making, choosing colors and flavors I thought each person would enjoy. "How thoughtful," Barbara had said, examining the cashmere blend scarf I'd made specifically in her favorite shade of blue. Such a personal approach to gift-giving. The pause before personal made it clear that this was not a compliment. The family usually exchanges gifts from Nordstrom or Tiffany, she'd continued, her voice carrying that helpful tone she used when explaining obvious social rules to people who apparently didn't understand them. It makes returns easier and ensures quality. Being educated about your inadequacy by someone who claims to care about your success feels worse than honest rejection. That night, Mark had explained that his family preferred practical gift exchanges, that homemade items made people uncomfortable because they felt obligated to keep things they might not actually use. I'd spent 3 weeks knitting those scarves, choosing patterns I thought would suit each person's style. But apparently, thoughtfulness was less important than conformity to family shopping protocols. Love that requires you to become someone else isn't love. It's a renovation project with unclear success criteria. The pattern continued through our marriage, helpful corrections about my teaching salary compared to more substantial career options, gentle guidance about social events where I might feel more comfortable staying home, concerned observations about my family's different approach to holidays and traditions, always framed as helpful, always delivered with a smile, always designed to remind me that I was a guest trying to earn permanent residency in a family where the admission requirements kept changing. When someone's help consistently makes you feel smaller rather than more capable, it's not actually help. But teaching elementary school had given me something Barbara hadn't counted on: experience with documentation. When a child's behavior concerns you, you keep records. You note patterns. You gather evidence before you involve parents or administrators. So I started keeping records of Barbara's behavior, not out of malice, but out of professional habit. Dates, conversations, witnesses present, exact quotes when possible. The same skills that help you advocate for struggling students work surprisingly well for protecting yourself from family members who see you as a problem to be solved. 3 months ago, Mark's grandmother Rose had made an offhand comment about family jewelry during one of our weekly coffee visits. She'd mentioned that her mother's sapphire necklace had such an interesting history, and that she sometimes wondered what had become of the original documentation. Rose was 91, sharp as ever, and the only family member who'd ever asked about my childhood, my work, my opinions on things that didn't relate to family protocols. Sometimes the most important conversations happen with people who ask questions because they care about answers rather than because they're gathering ammunition. That comment had led to 3 months of genealogy research, county record searches, and several very interesting conversations with elderly relatives on both sides of the family. Research skills developed for lesson planning translate remarkably well to investigating family histories that might not be quite what everyone believes. Sitting at Romano's tonight, listening to Barbara explain why I'd never be worthy of wearing the family necklace, I felt the particular satisfaction that comes from having done your homework thoroughly. So why did Rose's sudden interest in my folder feel like the moment when patient preparation was about to meet perfect timing? "Sarah, dear, you're being mysterious," Rose said, her 91-year-old eyes sharp with curiosity as she gestured toward my folder. "What kind of family history research have you been doing?" The question hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and revealing. Around our table, conversations had stopped mid-sentence. Even the bustle of Romano's seemed to quiet, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for what came next. Sometimes the most powerful moments arrive when people who never pay attention suddenly become very interested in what you have to say. Barbara's smile had frozen into something that looked painful to maintain. "I'm sure whatever genealogy project Sarah has been working on is fascinating, but we don't need to bore everyone with—" "Actually, I'd love to hear about it," David interrupted, setting down his wine glass with the careful attention of someone who just sensed drama brewing. "Family history is always interesting." Jessica nodded agreement. "Yeah. What did you find?" I opened the folder slowly, deliberately, the way I'd learned to reveal information to parents during difficult conferences, with patience, documentation, and respect for the fact that some truths require time to be properly understood. When you have evidence that changes everything, the presentation matters as much as the content. Well, I started researching after Grandma Rose mentioned wondering about the original documentation for the necklace. It seemed like such a beautiful family piece. I thought it would be nice to know more about its history. I removed the first document, a photocopied page from a 1923 estate inventory. This is from the estate of Victoria Hartwell, who died in Chicago in 1923. She was Rose's grandmother, Mark's great-great-grandmother. Rose leaned forward with sudden intensity. Victoria? I haven't heard that name in decades. She died before I was born, but Mother used to tell stories. According to this inventory, Victoria owned quite a bit of jewelry, including several pieces that were specifically bequeathed to different family members. Truth shared slowly creates space for understanding rather than defensiveness. Barbara's voice carried a sharp edge now. Sarah, this is hardly the time or place for amateur genealogy presentations. We're here to celebrate. Actually, I think this is exactly the right time, Uncle Robert said, surprising everyone by speaking up. If Sarah's found information about family jewelry, we should hear it. I smiled at him gratefully and removed the second document, a clearer copy of what appeared to be a will excerpt. Victoria left most of her jewelry to her daughters, but there was one specific piece that she handled differently. The table had gone completely quiet now. Even the waitstaff seemed to sense the tension and were giving our area a wide berth. The sapphire and diamond necklace that Victoria had received as a wedding gift was specifically bequeathed not to her daughters, but to her granddaughter, with a very particular condition. When family legends meet actual documentation, one of them usually turns out to be more accurate than the other. Rose's eyes were wide now. What condition? I read directly from the will excerpt. To my granddaughter Rose, I leave my sapphire and diamond wedding necklace, with the understanding that it shall pass not to her eldest son, but to the woman who shows the greatest kindness to Rose in her final years. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the background music seemed to have stopped. Barbara's face had gone from confident to confused, to something approaching panic. That can't be right. The necklace has always been passed down through the male line. Always. According to this will, Victoria specifically wanted it to go to whoever showed Rose the most kindness in her old age. Not to the eldest son's wife automatically, but to whoever Rose felt had been most caring toward her. Sometimes family traditions are less traditional than people want to believe. Jessica was staring at the documents with the fascination of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. So Grandma Rose gets to decide who gets the necklace? That's what the will says. And there's more. I removed a third document. This one more recent, bearing the letterhead of Morrison & Associates, estate planning attorneys. I contacted the law firm that handled Victoria's estate to see if they had any additional documentation. It turns out they've been trying to locate Rose for several years. Barbara's voice was barely a whisper now. Why? Because Victoria's will included a trust fund specifically for the maintenance and insurance of the necklace. The trust has been accumulating interest for nearly 40 years, waiting for proper contact with the beneficiary. When people build family legends around objects they don't actually own, reality has a way of creating awkward moments. Rose was staring at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language. A trust fund? For the necklace? Apparently Victoria was quite specific. She wanted to ensure that whoever inherited the necklace would have resources to maintain it properly, and that it would never be sold out of financial necessity. Mark finally found his voice. Sarah, how long have you known about this? I started researching 3 months ago, after Grandma Rose mentioned wondering about the original documentation. The attorneys confirmed everything last week. Research done out of curiosity becomes evidence when family assumptions meet legal reality. Barbara was gripping her wine glass so tightly I was worried it might shatter. There must be some mistake. The necklace has been in our family for generations. I've been taking care of it, preserving it. You've been taking wonderful care of it, I agreed. And according to the trust documentation, you'll be compensated for all the insurance and maintenance costs you've covered over the years. But it doesn't belong to you, Rose said slowly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who was beginning to understand something important. It belongs to me, and I get to decide who should have it next. So why did Barbara's complete shock feel less like victory and more like the moment everyone realizes that assumptions can be dangerous things to build your authority on? Rose, you need to understand that this is impossible, Barbara said, her voice carrying the desperate edge of someone whose world was being restructured without her permission. The necklace has been in my possession for 15 years. I've had it appraised, insured, maintained. With whose money? I asked gently, removing another document from my folder. According to the trust records, there's been a dedicated account paying for insurance and maintenance on the necklace since 1985. The restaurant seemed to fade around us as our family table became its own universe of revelation and confusion. Other diners continued their anniversary celebrations, unaware that ours had transformed into something between a family meeting and a legal deposition. When someone's authority is built on ownership they never actually had, the foundation tends to crumble quickly. Rose was studying the will excerpt with the intensity of someone reading a treasure map. Sarah, dear, what exactly does this mean? In practical terms? It means the necklace legally belongs to you, Grandma Rose. It always has. And according to Victoria's will, you get to choose who inherits it based on who has shown you the most kindness. Barbara's laugh sounded like something breaking. This is ridiculous. Rose, you know I've always taken excellent care of you. I visit every week, I handle your appointments, I make sure you have everything you need. Duty performed for appearances looks different from kindness offered from genuine care. You visit every Tuesday at 2 p.m. for exactly 45 minutes, Rose said slowly, her voice carrying a note I'd never heard before. You bring my groceries, which you purchase from a list I'm not allowed to modify. You schedule my appointments at times convenient for your schedule. Jessica was staring at her grandmother with growing awareness. Grandma Rose, are you saying Mom's visits aren't helpful? I'm saying your mother visits me the way someone visits a duty. Sarah visits me because she enjoys my company. When genuine affection meets calculated obligation, the difference becomes obvious to everyone watching. The truth of Rose's words settled over our table like morning light, revealing things that had been hidden in darkness. For 3 years, while Barbara had been explaining to everyone why I wasn't suitable for the family, I'd been spending Wednesday afternoons with Rose, not because Mark asked me to, but because I genuinely enjoyed her stories, her sharp wit, her perspectives on decades of family dynamics. Sarah brings me books from the library, Rose continued, her voice growing stronger. She listens to my stories about your grandfather. She asks about my opinions on current events, not just my medical appointments. Barbara's face was cycling through expressions like someone trying on different masks to see which one fit the moment. Rose, I handle your practical needs. That's more important than social visits. Is it? Rose's 91-year-old voice carried surprising steel. Sarah has been the only person in this family who treats me like someone whose thoughts matter rather than someone whose needs must be managed. Sometimes the most devastating indictments come from people who've been observing family dynamics with clarity that comes from age and patience. Mark was staring at his hands, his face pale. Grandma Rose, I didn't realize. I thought you were happy with the arrangements. You thought I was satisfied being managed rather than visited, Scheduled, rather than included. Uncle Robert cleared his throat. So legally, the necklace belongs to Rose? I nodded and pulled out another document. According to Morrison and Associates, the estate has been trying to locate Rose for years to transfer legal ownership and provide access to the trust fund. Trust fund? David leaned forward. How much money are we talking about? According to the latest statement, approximately $180,000. Victoria wanted to ensure that whoever inherited the necklace would never have to sell it for financial reasons. When generosity planned decades ago meets present-day assumptions, the results can be illuminating. Barbara was gripping the edge of the table now. This is impossible. I've been the one caring for family heirlooms. I've been the one maintaining traditions. You've been the one controlling traditions? Rose said quietly. There's a difference. The distinction landed like a small earthquake. Around our table, family members were processing the revelation that their understanding of family hierarchy had been built on incomplete information. Sarah, Jessica said slowly, how long have you been visiting Grandma Rose? Every Wednesday for about 2.5 years. We usually have tea and talk about books, or she tells me stories about the family. Every Wednesday? Mark turned to look at me. You never asked about my Wednesday afternoons. And when I did mention visiting your grandmother, your mother usually suggested that Rose might prefer more structured visits. When someone's contributions are consistently minimized, they often stop mentioning their contributions altogether. Barbara was looking around the table like someone seeking allies who were no longer available. This is very touching, but the practical reality is that I've been responsible for family traditions and heirlooms for 15 years. Surely that counts for something. It counts for exactly what it is, Rose said. Stewardship. You've been taking care of something that didn't belong to you, and according to these documents, you've been compensated for that care through the trust fund. I was never told about any trust fund. Because you never asked about the legal ownership of the necklace, I said gently. You assumed it belonged to the family collectively, and that assumption became everyone's understanding. Sometimes the biggest family secrets are simply information that no one thought to verify. The waitstaff had begun clearing other tables, but our corner of Romano's had become a pocket of suspended time where decades of assumptions were being quietly dismantled by legal documents and long overdue honesty. So what happens now? Mark asked. Rose looked around the table at her family, her son Robert, her daughter-in-law Barbara, her grandchildren Jessica and David and Mark, and me, the woman who'd been dismissed as temporary for 3 years. Now I make a decision about who should inherit my necklace, she said. According to Victoria's will, it should go to whoever has shown me the greatest kindness in my final years. Barbara opened her mouth to speak, but Rose held up a hand that carried surprising authority for someone we'd all been treating as needing management rather than respect. And I think we all know who that has been. So why did the moment of recognition feel less like winning and more like everyone finally seeing something that had been obvious all along? Rose, you need to think very carefully about this decision, Barbara said, her voice carrying the particular tone she used when she felt family hierarchy needed reinforcement. Family heirlooms should stay within blood family lines. That's how traditions work. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, revealing everything about how Barbara viewed my place in this family, even after 3 years of marriage to her son. When people show you what they really think about your belonging, believe them the first time. According to Victoria's will, kindness matters more than bloodlines, Rose replied, her voice steady as granite. And in my experience, the people who make the most noise about family traditions are often the ones who understand them least. Jessica was reading over the will excerpt with the intensity of someone discovering a family secret that changed everything she thought she knew. Grandma Rose, it really says whoever shows you the most kindness? Not automatically the eldest son's wife? That's exactly what it says. Victoria was apparently quite specific about wanting the necklace to go to someone who genuinely cared about the person wearing it, not just someone who cared about the necklace itself. Smart women from previous generations often found creative ways to ensure future kindness wouldn't be taken for granted. Mark finally found his voice, though it came out smaller than usual. Sarah, why didn't you tell me you'd been visiting Grandma Rose every week? The question revealed everything about how our marriage had slowly shifted toward avoiding topics that might create conflict with his mother. I did tell you, Mark, multiple times, but whenever I mentioned spending time with Rose, your mother would suggest that structured visits might be less overwhelming for someone her age. I never said she was overwhelming, Barbara protested. I said elderly people often prefer predictable schedules. You said Rose might find spontaneous visits stressful, and that family members should coordinate through you to avoid confusion. When someone appoints themselves as gatekeeper to your relationships, they're usually protecting their own position rather than anyone's well-being. Rose was watching this exchange with the expression of someone who'd been understanding family dynamics for far longer than anyone had given her credit for. Barbara, dear, when did you start believing that I needed protection from my own family members? The question landed with surgical precision. Barbara's face went through several expressions as she processed the implications. I was trying to make things easier for you. Managing too many visitors can be exhausting at your age. Managing visitors assumes that I'm incapable of managing my own relationships. Sarah doesn't visit me as a visitor. She visits me as family. When someone treats you like family instead of like a duty to be managed, the difference becomes obvious to everyone watching. Uncle Robert was studying the legal documents with the attention of someone who'd spent years handling estate planning. Sarah, this trust fund, has it really been accumulating interest for 40 years? According to Morrison and Associates, yes. Victoria was quite thorough in her planning. She wanted to ensure that the necklace would never become a financial burden for whoever inherited it. David whistled softly. $180,000 is substantial. The attorneys said Victoria was ahead of her time in understanding that family heirlooms can become expensive obligations rather than gifts if there aren't resources to maintain them properly. Generosity planned with wisdom often looks like magic to people who've only seen generosity without planning. Barbara was gripping her purse like it contained the secrets to family stability. This is all very interesting, but the practical reality is that Rose is 91 years old. She shouldn't be making major decisions about family heirlooms without proper guidance. The comment dropped into our conversation like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock that reached every corner of the table. Proper guidance from whom? Rose's voice could have cut diamond. From you? The person who's been treating me like a child who can't be trusted with her own relationships? Sometimes the most damaging thing you can say about someone is exactly what you've been thinking about them. Jessica was staring at her mother with growing horror. Mom, do you really think Grandma Rose can't make her own decisions? I think people her age can be easily influenced by people who have ulterior motives. Barbara's implication hung in the air like a storm cloud. She was suggesting that my 3 years of Wednesday afternoon visits had been strategic manipulation rather than genuine affection. When someone's worldview requires believing that kindness is always calculated, they reveal more about themselves than about anyone else. Barbara, Rose said, her voice carrying the weight of 9 decades of experience. What you're suggesting is that I'm too foolish to recognize genuine care when I receive it. I'm suggesting that Sarah might have had access to information about the necklace that influenced her behavior. What information? I asked quietly. I only learned about the will 3 months ago, but I've been visiting Rose for 2.5 years. Are you suggesting I have a time machine? Logic becomes a powerful weapon when someone's accusations don't align with basic chronology. Mark was looking between his mother and me like someone watching a tennis match where the stakes kept getting higher. Mom, Sarah couldn't have known about the inheritance when she started visiting Grandma Rose. She could have been investigating family assets from the beginning. The accusation was so absurd that several people around the table made involuntary sounds of disbelief. "Barbara," Uncle Robert said firmly, "you're suggesting that a third-grade teacher has been running a 3-year con game on a 91-year-old woman to steal family jewelry. Do you understand how that sounds?" When someone's paranoia reaches the point where elementary school teachers become master manipulators, reality has left the conversation entirely. Rose reached across the table and took my hand, her aged fingers surprisingly strong. "Sarah, dear, would you like to know what I've decided about the necklace?" The restaurant seemed to pause around us, as if even the other diners sensed that something significant was about to happen. "Grandma Rose, you don't need to decide anything tonight. This is supposed to be your anniversary celebration." "It's the perfect time to decide. Victoria left the necklace to someone who showed kindness to me in my final years. You've shown me more genuine kindness than anyone else in this family." She squeezed my hand gently. "The necklace is yours, dear. Legally, emotionally, and practically. You've earned it through 3 years of treating me like someone whose thoughts and feelings matter. Sometimes justice arrives not through dramatic revelations, but through quiet recognition of what has been true all along." Barbara's face had gone completely white. "Rose, you can't be serious. Sarah has only been in the family for 3 years. And in those 3 years, she's spent more quality time with me than the rest of you combined. So why did receiving something I'd never expected to inherit feel less like winning and more like finally being seen for who I'd always been?" "This is absolutely unacceptable," Barbara said, standing abruptly from her chair with enough force to make our water glasses tremble. "Rose, you're making a decision that will affect this family for generations based on temporary emotional attachment." Her voice carried through Romano's dining room, drawing stares from other tables. The elegant anniversary celebration had transformed into something that felt more like a courtroom drama, with family members choosing sides in real time. When someone's authority is challenged in public, their true character often reveals itself through the volume and desperation of their response. "Temporary emotional attachment?" Rose's voice carried the steel that comes from 9 decades of not suffering fools gladly. "Barbara, are you referring to the 3 years of weekly visits, or the fact that Sarah remembers my birthday without calendar reminders?" Mark was sitting perfectly still, his face pale as winter moonlight. "Mom, maybe we should discuss this privately." "No," Rose interrupted firmly. "Enough family business has been handled privately. It's time for some public honesty." The words fell like dominoes, each one creating space for truths that had been carefully avoided for years. Sometimes the most important family conversations happen in restaurants because no one can run away from inconvenient truths. Jessica was staring at the legal documents spread across our table like someone trying to solve a puzzle, with pieces that kept revealing new pictures. "Mom, how long have you known about Victoria's will?" Barbara's hesitation lasted just long enough to confirm everyone's growing suspicions. The specific language, it was never clearly explained. "That's not what I asked. How long have you known that the necklace belonged to Grandma Rose, not to the family generally?" When direct questions meet evasive answers, the silence often contains more information than words would. Uncle Robert was studying his daughter-in-law with the expression of someone who'd just realized they'd been operating with incomplete information for years. "Barbara, did you know about the trust fund?" There were always financial arrangements for the insurance, but I assumed they came from general family resources." "You assumed? Or you were told?" I asked gently. Barbara's face flushed red. "What are you implying?" "I'm asking whether you received documentation about the trust fund payments and chose not to share that information with Rose, or whether you genuinely didn't know the money was coming from Victoria's estate." Sometimes the kindest interpretation of someone's behavior is also the one that reveals the scope of their deception. David had been quietly reading through the legal papers while the adults argued around him. These trust statements go back 15 years. They're addressed to Rose Whitman, primary beneficiary, and copied to current custodian of estate items. Mom, you've been receiving copies of these statements for 15 years. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the restaurant's background music seemed to pause. Barbara sat back down slowly, her face cycling through expressions like someone processing a diagnosis that changed everything she thought she knew about her condition. The attorneys, they said the payments were for maintenance and insurance. They never specified that Rose had decision-making authority. Because you never asked, Rose said quietly. You received money to maintain something, and you assumed that receiving the money made you the owner. When financial responsibility is confused with legal ownership, the results can be illuminating for everyone involved. Mark finally found his voice, though it sounded strained. Sarah, how much of this did you know when you started researching? I knew nothing when I started. Grandma Rose mentioned wondering about the original documentation, so I thought it would be nice to learn more about the necklace's history. I had no idea about the trust fund or the inheritance conditions until I contacted the attorneys 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks? Barbara's voice reached a pitch that could have shattered crystal. You've known about this for 3 weeks and said nothing? I wanted to verify everything before sharing information that might be upsetting or incorrect. And I wanted to understand the legal implications before involving family members in what might have been a misunderstanding. When you're dealing with family members who shoot the messenger, taking time to ensure your message is bulletproof becomes a survival strategy. Jessica was looking between her mother and grandmother with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand family dynamics from an entirely different perspective. Grandma Rose, has Mom really been managing your life instead of just helping with it? Rose smiled sadly. Your mother genuinely believes that managing people is the same as caring for them. She arranges my life very efficiently, but she rarely asks what I might actually want or need. That's not fair, Barbara protested. I handle your medical appointments, your grocery shopping, your household maintenance. You schedule my medical appointments at times that work with your calendar. You bring me groceries from a list you created based on what you think elderly people should eat. You arrange for household maintenance without asking whether I'm happy with the services you've chosen. When care becomes control, the difference reveals itself through who gets to make decisions about their own life. The family members around our table were processing this information with various levels of shock and recognition. Some people were discovering that their grandmother had been managed rather than cared for. Others were realizing that their understanding of family helpfulness might need recalibrating. Sarah asks me what books I'd like to read, Rose continued. She brings me tea that I actually enjoy rather than tea that's supposed to be good for my digestion. When she helps with something, she asks how I'd like it done, rather than doing it the way she thinks it should be done. The difference between serving someone and controlling someone often comes down to who gets to express preferences. Mark was staring at his hands, his voice barely audible. I didn't know you were unhappy with the arrangements. You didn't ask. None of you asked. You assumed that being taken care of was the same as being happy. Barbara was gripping her purse so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. This is ridiculous. I've devoted 15 years to taking care of family responsibilities. I've maintained traditions, preserved heirlooms, ensured that everything was handled properly. You've controlled family interactions while receiving payment from a trust fund you never told me existed, Rose said calmly. That's not devotion. That's employment you forgot to acknowledge. When someone discovers they've been paid for services they claimed were acts of love, the conversation about motivation becomes unavoidable. The revelation settled over our table like evening shadows, changing the shape and color of everything we thought we understood about family dynamics. "So what happens now?" Uncle Robert asked quietly. Rose looked around the table at her family, then reached for the necklace box that had started this entire evening's revelations. Now Sarah gets what Victoria always intended: a family heirloom given to someone who understands that kindness matters more than entitlement. So why did Barbara's complete shock feel less like justice and more like watching someone realize they'd been living a story that was different from the one everyone else was experiencing? The drive home from Romano's felt like traveling through a landscape that had been fundamentally altered while I wasn't paying attention. Mark sat in the passenger seat of our Honda, staring out the window at suburban streets that looked the same as they had this morning, but somehow felt completely different. When family dynamics shift dramatically in public, the private aftermath often feels like learning to breathe different air. Neither of us had spoken since we'd left the restaurant, where the evening had ended with Rose officially transferring the necklace to my care, and Barbara leaving without saying goodbye to anyone. The velvet jewelry box sat in my purse like a small miracle I wasn't quite ready to examine yet. "I had no idea," Mark said finally, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from watching your understanding of your family get reconstructed in real time. "About any of it. The trust fund, the will, how my mother had been managing Grandma Rose." I pulled into our driveway and turned off the engine, but neither of us moved to get out of the car. Sometimes the most important conversations happen in vehicles, where the confined space creates intimacy, and the option to leave exists even when no one takes it. Honesty shared in small spaces often feels safer than honesty shared in houses, where every room holds memories of avoiding difficult topics. "Mark, did you really not know I was visiting Rose every Wednesday?" He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. "I knew you mentioned visiting her sometimes, but Mom always said Rose preferred shorter, scheduled visits, and that too much spontaneous family contact could be overwhelming for someone her age." "Did that sound right to you? That your grandmother, who raised 3 children and managed a household for 70 years, couldn't handle deciding when she wanted visitors?" Sometimes the most revealing question is asking someone to examine whether the information they accepted actually makes logical sense. Mark's silence stretched between us like a bridge that might not hold our weight. Through our windshield, I could see our neighbors' houses, warm with evening light, families settling into their own versions of normal. Whatever normal meant when foundational assumptions about family relationships turned out to be built on incomplete information. I think I stopped asking questions because asking questions created conflict with my mother, and avoiding conflict felt more important than understanding what was actually happening. The admission hung in the air between us, honest and painful and necessary. When someone realizes they've been choosing peace over truth, the conversation about priorities becomes unavoidable. "Mark, do you understand what your mother accused me of tonight? She suggested that I spent 3 years manipulating a 91-year-old woman to steal family jewelry. She was upset. People say things they don't mean when they're upset. Do they? Or do they say things they usually keep hidden when they're upset?" The distinction was important, and we both knew it. Barbara's accusations hadn't come from nowhere. They'd revealed exactly what she thought of me, of my motivations, of my place in the family hierarchy. When someone's mask slips in public, the face underneath is usually the one they've been hiding in private. I reached into my purse and pulled out the jewelry box, setting it on the dashboard between us. Even in the dim light of our garage, the sapphires caught what little illumination was available and transformed it into something that looked like captured starlight. "I never expected this. I visited your grandmother because I enjoyed her company, not because I thought it would lead to inheriting anything." "I know that. Sarah, I know that's not who you are. But your mother doesn't know that. After 3 years of marriage, 3 years of family dinners and holiday celebrations and anniversary parties, she still thinks I'm capable of running a long-term manipulation scheme on your elderly grandmother." When someone consistently sees the worst possible motives in your behavior, they're usually protecting themselves from seeing the worst possible truth about their own. Mark finally turned to look at me directly. What do you want me to say? That my mother was wrong? That she handled everything badly tonight? That she's been controlling instead of caring? I want you to decide whether you agree with her assessment of my character, or whether you think she might be protecting something else. The question sat between us like a small explosive device, dangerous and necessary and impossible to ignore. Sometimes the most important questions are the ones that require people to choose between protecting relationships and protecting truth. Sarah, you know I don't think you're manipulative. You know I don't think you married me for family connections or inheritance possibilities. But you also don't think your mother's accusations were completely out of line, or you would have said something during dinner. Mark's silence was answer enough. For 3 years, I'd watched him navigate family conflicts by avoiding them, by finding middle ground that usually involved me accommodating Barbara's preferences rather than Mark defending my position. When conflict avoidance becomes someone's primary relationship strategy, the people they claim to love often end up carrying the cost of that avoidance. I don't know how to handle family conflict, he said finally. I grew up in a house where disagreeing with my mother meant weeks of tension and passive-aggressive comments and guilt about disrupting family harmony. So you learned to keep peace by making sure I absorbed the conflict instead of addressing it? I didn't think of it that way. How did you think of it? When someone realizes they've been using their partner as a buffer against family dysfunction, the conversation about protection becomes complicated. Mark stared at the jewelry box on our dashboard, perhaps realizing that the evening's revelations extended beyond family heirlooms to family patterns that had shaped his marriage in ways he'd never examined. I thought I was protecting both of you, keeping you from fighting, keeping her from feeling excluded, finding ways for everyone to get along. But what actually happened was that I spent 3 years being criticized, dismissed, and managed by someone who never intended to accept me, while you stood by and allowed it, because intervening would have been uncomfortable for you. The words landed like stones thrown into calm water, creating ripples that would reach every shore of our relationship. Truth shared after years of diplomatic silence often sounds harsher than it would have if it had been shared gradually all along. Sarah, what do you want from me? What do you need me to do differently? I picked up the jewelry box and held it in my hands, feeling the weight of something that had traveled through generations to reach someone who would value it for the right reasons. I need you to decide whether you're married to me or still primarily committed to managing your mother's emotions, because I can't continue being the person who absorbs family dysfunction so everyone else can avoid dealing with it. So why did finally naming the problem feel less like creating conflict and more like offering both of us a chance to build something authentic instead of just functional? 3 weeks after the anniversary dinner that changed everything, I sat in Rose's living room on a Wednesday afternoon, sharing tea and watching her try on the sapphire necklace for the first time in 15 years. "It's heavier than I remembered," she said, touching the intricate Victorian setting with fingers that trembled slightly but still moved with purpose. "But it feels right, like it's finally where it belongs." Sometimes the most profound transformations happen quietly, in living rooms where people finally get to make decisions about their own lives. The past 3 weeks had brought changes none of us had quite expected. Barbara had initially refused to speak to anyone in the family, then had gradually begun reaching out with what appeared to be genuine attempts to understand how her behavior had affected people. Mark had started therapy to work through decades of conflict avoidance, and I had spent considerable time thinking about what I actually wanted from family relationships. "Rose, can I ask you something personal?" "Dear, at 91, everything is personal. Ask whatever you'd like." Did you always know that Barbara was controlling your life rather than just helping with it? Rose smiled with the particular wisdom that comes from watching family dynamics play out over decades. I suspected it gradually, but when you're 91 and people assume you need management, it becomes easier to accept help even when the help feels more like supervision. When someone's autonomy is eroded gradually, the loss often feels normal until someone offers a different approach. What made you realize the difference? You did. You were the first person in years who asked what I wanted instead of telling me what I needed. The distinction settled between us like afternoon light filtering through curtains, illuminating something that had always been true but hadn't always been visible. The difference between serving someone and managing someone often comes down to who gets to express preferences about their own life. Through Rose's living room window, I could see her small garden where she'd been tending tomato plants that Barbara had repeatedly suggested were too much work for someone her age. The tomatoes were thriving, perhaps because Rose had been allowed to tend them according to her own schedule, rather than someone else's efficiency plan. Sarah, how are things with Mark since the dinner? Different. Better in some ways, more complicated in others. He's learning to recognize when he's avoiding conflict instead of addressing problems. And with Barbara? I set down my teacup carefully, choosing words that would be honest without being cruel. I think she's genuinely shocked by how her behavior looked to other people. She's asked to meet for coffee next week. When someone's self-perception meets external reality, the gap often creates space for growth that wasn't possible before. Rose nodded thoughtfully. Barbara isn't malicious, dear. She's controlling, and she's been allowed to control for so long that she forgot the difference between helping and managing. But she's not evil. I know that. I think she genuinely believed she was taking care of family responsibilities appropriately. The question is whether she can learn to take care of family responsibilities while allowing family members to maintain autonomy. Character development in adults often requires discovering that good intentions don't automatically create positive results. My phone buzzed with a text message from Mark. Therapy was helpful today. Home by 6. Want to try cooking together? The message felt like a small miracle. For 3 years, our evenings had been carefully scheduled around Mark's need to check in with his mother, to ensure she wasn't feeling excluded or upset by changes in family routines. The idea of cooking together without first confirming that Barbara didn't need anything felt revolutionary. Things are changing, I told Rose. Slowly but definitely changing. Change is like tending plants, Rose said, touching one of the African violets on her windowsill. It requires patience, attention, and acceptance that growth happens on its own timeline rather than ours. Wisdom shared by people who've observed decades of human development often sounds simple because it's taken years to distill complexity into truth. Rose, do you want me to give the necklace back? She looked at me with surprise. Why would you want to do that? Because I didn't marry Mark for family heirlooms. I married him because I love him. The necklace is beautiful, and I'm honored that you chose to give it to me. But I don't need it to feel like part of the family. Dear child, that's exactly why the necklace belongs with you. Rose reached across the small table between our chairs and took my hands in hers, her skin soft as paper, but her grip surprisingly strong. Victoria left the necklace to whoever showed me kindness in my final years. Not whoever needed the necklace, not whoever deserved recognition, but whoever understood that kindness matters more than obligation. Gifts given to people who don't need them often find their way to people who understand their true value. The trust fund money will help you maintain the necklace properly, but more importantly, it ensures that you'll never have to choose between keeping family history and meeting practical needs. I thought about Victoria, a woman I'd never met who'd died decades before I was born, planning so carefully for the well-being of people she would never know. Her foresight had created space for kindness to be recognized and rewarded generations later. Do you think she knew something like this would happen? That family assumptions might not match legal reality? Rose laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Victoria lived through the Depression, 2 world wars, and raising 3 children during times when women had very little legal protection. She understood that people's good intentions don't always translate into good outcomes. Generosity planned with wisdom often looks like magic to people who've only seen generosity without foresight. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, painting Rose's living room in shades of gold and amber. In a few hours, Mark would come home from therapy, and we would cook dinner together, and we would continue the slow work of building a marriage based on authenticity rather than conflict avoidance. Tomorrow, I would meet Barbara for coffee, and we would begin the difficult work of learning to have a relationship based on mutual respect rather than one-sided management. But right now, I was sitting with a 91-year-old woman who had taught me that true family relationships are built through consistent kindness rather than strategic obligation. "Thank you," I told Rose, "for the necklace, for the trust, for teaching me the difference between being managed and being loved." "Thank you," she replied, "for showing me that being 91 doesn't mean surrendering the right to choose who spends time in my living room." So why did this quiet afternoon feel like the most profound victory? Not because anyone had been defeated, but because everyone had finally been allowed to be authentic. The coffee shop where I met Barbara the following Tuesday was the kind of neutral territory that makes difficult conversations possible. Busy enough to provide background noise for privacy, public enough to encourage civilized behavior, comfortable enough to allow for conversations that might take longer than originally planned. Barbara arrived exactly on time, carrying herself with the careful posture of someone who'd spent considerable time preparing for a conversation she wasn't sure how to navigate. When someone who's used to controlling situations has to enter unfamiliar emotional territory, the vulnerability often shows in their body language before it appears in their words. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said, settling into the chair across from me with the kind of precision that suggested this meeting felt as formal as a business appointment. "Thank you for asking. I wasn't sure whether you wanted to have this conversation." I wasn't sure either, until my therapist suggested that understanding your perspective might help me understand my own behavior. When someone mentions therapy in the first 2 minutes of a difficult conversation, it usually signals genuine intention to change, rather than just resolve immediate conflict. Barbara had never mentioned therapy before, and the fact that she'd sought professional help suggested the anniversary dinner had created more self-reflection than I'd expected. "How long have you been seeing someone?" "2 weeks, since the dinner at Romano's." Barbara's smile looked painful but genuine. "Turns out that having your family dynamics exposed in public creates excellent motivation for examining your behavior patterns. Sometimes public embarrassment becomes the catalyst for private growth that should have happened years earlier." "Barbara, can I ask what you hope to accomplish by meeting today?" I wanted to apologize, and I wanted to understand what I did wrong, so I can learn to do better. The words carried the careful precision of someone who'd practiced them, but they also carried something that sounded like genuine humility. Apologies that include requests for education often signal more sincere intention to change than apologies that focus solely on expressing regret. "What does your therapist say about the situation?" Barbara's laugh held no humor, but it didn't hold defensiveness either. "She says I've been confusing control with care for so long that I've forgotten the difference. She says I've been treating family members like problems to be managed rather than people to be supported." How does that feel to hear? Terrible and accurate. The honesty was stark and surprising. Barbara had never admitted to being wrong about anything family-related in the 3 years I'd known her. When someone stops defending their behavior and starts examining it, the conversation shifts from conflict resolution to relationship building. "Sarah, I need you to understand that I genuinely believed was helping Rose, managing her schedule, handling her practical needs, ensuring she was safe and cared for. I believe that. I don't think you were deliberately trying to control her life. But that's what I was doing. Yes. The acknowledgement sat between us like a bridge that might support more honest conversation if we were careful with our weight. Truth shared without defensive justification often creates space for understanding that wasn't possible when everyone was focused on being right. My therapist asked me to think about the difference between helping someone and helping myself feel useful. It's an uncomfortable distinction. What did you discover? Barbara stared into her coffee cup like it contained answers to questions she'd never thought to ask. I discovered that I needed to be needed more than Rose needed to be managed, and I confused my need to feel important with her need for assistance. When someone realizes they've been serving their own emotional needs through their service to others, the conversation about motivation becomes both painful and necessary. Barbara, what do you want our relationship to look like going forward? I want to learn how to be a mother-in-law who adds value to your life rather than creating stress. I want to understand how to support your marriage to Mark rather than whatever I've been doing. What have you been doing? According to my therapist, creating a triangle where Mark had to choose between keeping me happy and keeping you happy, instead of building a marriage where you and Mark could be happy together. When family dysfunction gets named accurately, the people involved often discover they've been playing roles in a system no one consciously designed. How do you feel about Mark going to therapy too? Guilty that he needs therapy to undo patterns I helped create. Proud that he's willing to do the work. Hopeful that he'll learn to have a relationship with me that doesn't require sacrificing his relationship with you. The progression of emotions was complex and seemed genuine. Barbara was processing her role in family dynamics with more nuance than I'd expected. Growth in adults often looks messy and complicated because it requires reconstructing patterns that took decades to establish. Sarah, can I ask you something that might be difficult? Of course. Do you think I can learn to be different? Or am I too old? Too set in my patterns? Too used to controlling things to develop healthier relationships? The question was asked with the kind of vulnerability I'd never heard from Barbara before, and it deserved a thoughtful answer. When someone asks whether they're capable of change, they're usually ready to begin the work that change requires. I think anyone who's willing to examine their behavior honestly and get professional help with changing it is capable of growth. The question is whether you're willing to be uncomfortable while you learn new ways of relating to people. I'm already uncomfortable. I've been uncomfortable since the anniversary dinner. The question is whether I can use that discomfort productively. What would productive discomfort look like? Learning to ask Rose what she wants instead of deciding what she needs. Learning to support your marriage instead of competing with it. Learning to be helpful rather than controlling. When someone can articulate specific behavior changes rather than just general intentions to do better, the likelihood of actual change increases significantly. Barbara, what would you need from me to make those changes possible? Patience while I learn, honesty when I slip back into old patterns, willingness to believe that I can change, even when the evidence is still developing. The request was reasonable and specific, which made it easier to consider granting. Requests for support that include acknowledgement of ongoing imperfection often signal more realistic expectations than promises of immediate transformation. I can offer those things, but I also need something from you. What? I need you to understand that protecting Mark from conflict isn't the same as supporting our marriage. If I have concerns about family dynamics, I need to know that you'll listen rather than immediately defending or explaining. That's fair, and probably necessary. We finished our coffee in companionable silence, two women who'd spent 3 years misunderstanding each other, beginning the work of building something more authentic and sustainable. So why did this quiet conversation feel more significant than the dramatic confrontation at Romano's? Not because anyone had won, but because everyone had finally started telling the truth? 6 months later, the garden party celebrating Rose's 92nd birthday took place in her backyard, among the tomato plants she'd been tending with renewed enthusiasm since Barbara stopped managing her gardening schedule. The guest list was small, but genuine. Family members who came because they wanted to spend time with Rose, rather than because attendance was expected. Sometimes the most meaningful celebrations happen when people gather out of affection rather than obligation. I wore the sapphire necklace for the second time since inheriting it, and it felt less like a family heirloom and more like a symbol of relationships built on genuine care rather than strategic positioning. The afternoon light caught the stones and scattered tiny rainbows across the table, where Rose was opening gifts that people had chosen because they thought she'd enjoy them, not because they fit predetermined categories of appropriate presents. "Sarah, that necklace looks perfect on you," Jessica said, settling into the chair beside me with a glass of lemonade and the relaxed posture of someone who no longer felt responsible for managing family tensions. "It feels perfect. Not because it's valuable, but because it represents something important about how we treat people we care about." Objects become meaningful when they symbolize principles rather than just monetary worth. Mark was helping Rose navigate her new tablet, a birthday gift from David that had initially worried Barbara until she realized that 91-year-old people are capable of learning new technology when they're interested in the outcome rather than intimidated by the process. "Mom's been different since she started therapy," Jessica observed. "More present, I guess. Like she's actually participating in conversations rather than directing them. Change is possible at any age, but it requires genuine willingness to examine patterns that have become comfortable, even when they're not healthy." Growth in family relationships often happens slowly, then all at once, like seasons changing. Barbara approached our table carrying a piece of Rose's birthday cake and the careful posture of someone still learning how to navigate relationships without controlling them. "Sarah, could I steal you for a quick conversation?" "Of course." We walked to the quieter end of Rose's garden, where her flower beds demonstrated what happened when someone was allowed to tend their space according to their own aesthetic preferences, rather than other people's efficiency standards. Private conversations in gardens often feel safer than private conversations in houses where walls hold memories of previous conflicts. "I wanted you to know that Mark and I had dinner last week, just the two of us. And he told me how much happier he's been since we all started working on healthier family patterns." How did that feel to hear? Painful and encouraging. Painful because it confirmed that my behavior was affecting his well-being. Encouraging because change is actually creating positive results. When someone can hold both regret and hope simultaneously, they're usually making genuine progress. Barbara, what's been the most difficult part of changing these patterns? Learning to sit with discomfort instead of immediately trying to fix or control situations. My therapist calls it tolerating uncertainty, and it turns out I've been terrible at it for decades. What's been the most surprising part? Discovering that people actually prefer authentic relationships, even when authentic means less polished or predictable. I'd been so focused on making everything smooth and proper that I'd forgotten people value genuine connection more than flawless execution. When someone realizes that perfectionism has been preventing intimacy, the conversation about priorities becomes transformative. Through the garden, I could see Rose showing her great-grandchildren how to identify ripe tomatoes, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who knew her opinions were valued rather than tolerated. Mark was helping Uncle Robert set up speakers for music, moving with the easy confidence of someone who no longer needed to monitor every family interaction for potential conflict. "Sarah, can I ask you something personal?" "Sure." "Do you think Mark and I can develop a healthy mother-son relationship, or have I damaged that connection permanently?" When someone asks whether relationships can be repaired, they're usually ready to do the work that repair requires. I think relationships can be rebuilt, when both people are willing to acknowledge what wasn't working and commit to creating something different. You and Mark both seem committed to that process. It's harder than I expected. Learning to be supportive without being controlling, to care without managing, to help without taking over. Most worthwhile changes are harder than expected, but they're also more rewarding than expected. Barbara smiled with something that looked like genuine peace rather than performed contentment. 6 months ago, if someone had told me that Rose would be happier, Mark would be healthier, and you would be willing to have cake and conversation with me, I wouldn't have believed any of it was possible. Transformation often exceeds our expectations because we base our expectations on current limitations rather than future possibilities. As the afternoon light began to fade, families started gathering their children and their gift bags, hugging Rose goodbye with the easy affection of people who knew they were welcome to visit whenever they wanted, rather than only when visits had been pre-approved through proper channels. Mark and I were among the last to leave, staying to help Rose clean up dishes and put away chairs, the kind of practical help that feels like love because it's offered freely rather than performed dutifully. "Sarah, dear," Rose said as we carried the last glasses into her kitchen, "what did you learn from all of this? About families? About relationships? About yourself?" The question deserved a thoughtful answer, because the past 6 months had taught me things about human nature that would influence how I approached relationships for the rest of my life. Sometimes the most important lessons come from situations we never chose, but handled with more grace than we knew we possessed. I learned that kindness is different from niceness. Kindness sometimes requires difficult conversations and clear boundaries. Niceness often requires avoiding truth in favor of comfort. What else? I learned that family relationships work best when everyone gets to be authentic rather than when everyone gets along. Authentic relationships can weather conflict and grow stronger. Relationships based on avoiding conflict usually become superficial over time. And I learned that inheritance, whether it's jewelry or behavior patterns or family roles, can be chosen rather than automatically accepted. We get to decide which traditions to continue and which ones to modify based on whether they serve love or just preserve familiarity. Rose smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd watched difficult growth happen in her own garden and her own family. Wisdom shared across generations often sounds simple because it's been tested by decades of experience. "The necklace found its way to the right person," she said. "Not because you were entitled to it, but because you understood what it was really worth." What was it really worth? The reminder that genuine care creates more lasting value than strategic positioning. So why did this quiet garden cleanup feel like the most significant inheritance of all? Not because we'd gained something valuable, but because we'd all learned the difference between what we thought we wanted and what actually made us happy?